Welcome everyone to the 66th Produce Safety Educators call. My name is Betsy Bin. I'm the director of the Produce Safety Alliance and joined by the PSA team and our esteemed guest who I'll introduce in a moment. You are joining us for what is the third in our H2O-Go series looking at post-harvest water. As you all know, post-harvest water implementation has the compliance date started in January. And so we're working through some information about post-harvest water as was requested on the last call. So today we're going to talk about the practical recommendations to meet post-harvest agricultural water requirements. As we go through some basic instructions, if my little computer will let me advance. Give me 1 second. There you go. All participants are muted. There will be time for questions and discussions at the end of the meeting. We do have the power to unmute you, so stay around for those questions. Feel free to use the chat box to ask questions. We will keep them fed to the people that are presenting, and they may or may not want to stop to answer them, but we'll try to move through those as we can. This session will be recorded and the presentation will be shared via our listserv and on our website after the call, as we always do. For those of you that may be new, there's that information. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect legal advice, views, or positions of the PSA and its members, nor any entities they represent. First of all, two things to bring to your attention. PSA and NECAFs are working on a look back survey that was launched a few weeks ago. It allows for the information we're seeking is from growers themselves and is aimed at helping us understand expenses, problems with implementation, all based at trying to figure out what are educational materials and training that may be necessary. The survey is set to close June the 1st. It is available in English and Spanish. There are the two links to that. I know there are lots of surveys floating around, but if you could forward that to growers you work with, that would be super helpful. Next. I would like to welcome Dr. Yuli Menensis, who is with the Produce Safety Alliance as our newest Spanish language extension associate based in Miami, Florida. So you want to say hello, Yuli?
Hello, everyone. I'm super glad to have joined the team. And as Betsy mentioned, I am located in Miami. Happy to help you in any way that I can. Thank you.
Yes, we're super happy to have her. She has a ton of experience. She came to us from Nebraska, where she was at for about 10 years, and has a background in water reuse and sustainability in the entirety of the food industry, not just produce. But we're super happy that she has joined the team. She's been already very active. She's working on becoming a PSA lead trainer or a trainer. And then she's also been helping as the secondary reviewer for the PSA Spanish translation of the PSR preamble that is being led by Dr. Laura Acuña Maldonado on our team. So glad to have you with us. Okay, so this webinar says it concludes. I'm not entirely sure this will be the last. It may be the last of this series. I wouldn't count us out as never doing this again. On a harvest and post-harvest water series, thank you, it even says that for now. We're prioritizing the release of educational materials that we went over in the last one. Some of those are in the final edits and we're still processing a few of those others, but we are working to get those out as quickly as possible. And you'll continue to see us working on subpart E outreach. Obviously, the pre-harvest water section is not finalized yet, but there's work to be done there with what we think is going to happen, I think. And then on top of it, more work with the harvest and the post-harvest. So today we're joined on the call by Dr. Laura Strawn from VTech. Do you want me to say the whole name? Because that might trip me up. You know, the whole name of Virginia.
Oh, Virginia Tech is fine. Or okay. VT. We're good.
There you go.
Yeah.
Dr. Michelle Danyluk from the University of Florida and Dr. Faith Critzer from the University of Georgia. I cannot tell you how thankful we are that they were willing to do this, as they're all very busy people. But this will be a really good webinar to start putting pieces on what does this actually look like moving forward and what are some things you should know. So with that, I will hand it off. I believe I'm going to Faith first. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, Faith's
There you
gonna
go.
share the slide deck.
There
Yeah.
you go.
I just
So-
want to let you know Virginia Tech is 2 words and University of Florida and University of Georgia are 3. So, but it's a challenging one. I'm surprised Tommy hasn't gotten you all hokied out. All righty. All right, no answer to that. Okay. So like Betsy mentioned, Faith and Michelle and I are really glad to be here. I am going to table set for you today, and we are going to kind of continue this conversation about water with practical recommendations to meet the post-harvest Ag.Water requirements. So let's go to the next slide, Faith. Just a little bit of a note, and I know Betsy mentioned, but obviously if we're highlighting certain products, they're just examples. We are not making any kinds of recommendations or endorsements just for teaching purposes today. I know we use a label and we're not saying that company is the best. We also want to give a big shout out to Dr. Keith Schneider, University of Florida, for some of the slides that we have poached for this presentation. So, and he is a great resource as well. So next slide. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We are going to obviously delve into this topic around post-harvest water, and our discussion points that we really want to touch on are sort of 3 things or threefold. We want to think about, do we need to wash? Do we have to use water? We also then want to think about considering reducing the time that produce is in contact with the water, and how does that sort of reduce our risk, and again, what are the different requirements around each. We also then want to touch on sanitizers and how we can treat effectively and appropriately. We want to talk about why we do this and how the science supports the use of sanitizers, even though it's not a requirement in the produce safety rule. So next slide. So we all know that there are many uses of post-harvest water, and there are a lot of really great reasons to use it in terms of cooling, right? Can remove dirt and debris, commodity movement, in terms of conveyance systems. We might use it for hand washing, and definitely we hope for cleaning and sanitizing purposes. But we use this a lot in different facilities, and different facilities are not going to be created equal. We can go 4 sticks to a lid all the way up to, a really sophisticated type of a packing operation. We also can use post-harvest water, obviously at harvest, right? So if we're field packing or something like that. So we just want to think about how we're using all these different things to give you kind of a good broad brushstroke or umbrella type 30,000 foot view. So let's go to the next slide. So to get everybody on the same page, it's just a reminder, what does the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule require for water, harvest and post-harvest water? We're obviously going to need to start out with all of our water meeting the no detectable generic E. coli per 100 milliliter sample, right? We want to start off with our best quality of water, and this then we're going to carry all the way through. How we decide to carry it all the way through, this leads into our second tenet of the rule, which would be that we need to establish these water change schedules for our recirculated water. Maintaining the quality of that water in a recirculated system is going to be challenging as we are constantly introducing product, which could bring potential foreseeable hazards. So we want to think about, how are we going to maintain that quality of that water? We start out with the best quality water. How do we keep it? This could be in the realm of establishing a water change schedule. How are we going to do that? We're going to probably visually monitor for this buildup of organic material, and we're going to talk much more about that as the presentation goes on. We also are going to, again, this isn't a requirement per se, but it's highly recommended, and we're going to convince you that the science is saying absolutely you must use a sanitizer. But if we are going to use a sanitizer to help us control that quality of water, the rule is going to tell us that if we are using sanitizers, they need to be approved and labeled for use. And you're going to get a really neat demonstration, and you're going to get to play along where we walk through something like that to look at the label and how and what it is approved for use on. So next slide. So we are here, right? Betsy mentioned that, but we are definitely in our compliance date period of FDA took a cascade approach for the different size of business. So this just needs, just serves as a reminder that if you're, a large business or over that 500,000 threshold mark, you could technically, depending on the state you're in, based on your regulator, they're going to ask you, right, about your post-harvest water. They're going to look at it. Now, if we're in Virginia, they're taking a little bit more of an education type approach, but this is really variable depending on who you run into. So for our small businesses, it's going to be 2024, and our very small businesses 2025. And what we need to know as educators right now is we need to get our growers ready so they're going to be able to be in compliance and pass those inspections. So next slide. So it seems simple, right? We start out with really good quality water, and then we just maintain it all the way through, depending on what we're doing. So what's the big deal, right? What is this? Why does this cause us so much headache? And this is really because water facilitates this microbial transfer from contaminated produce to non-contaminated produce. And this is sort of where we get into using sanitizers and thinking about when do we change our water, because if we have an issue, it's going to make it a lot worse, right? And Faith has this wonderful animation where she's going to basically talk about cross-contamination in the water. And it's a really cool visual. If you're a visual person like me, you will love it. But foodborne pathogens, they can go unnoticed. We can't see them, right? So we're not going to be able to see them in the water. If they're there and if they're in the water, everything else that's coming into that contact with the water potentially can get contaminated. We also, it's an opportunity there to spread decay organisms, right? Or spoilage organisms, these molds, yeast, bacteria that are going to decrease our shelf life. And this is actually a really interesting note. There's a double benefit to being able to manage your post-harvest water quality. The double benefit is that not only for a food safety perspective, but also for a post-harvest quality aspect. And again, it's really important to know that washing does not alleviate pre-harvest contamination risk, right? So I'll mention this a bunch more times in this presentation, but it's not in lieu of any of the other things we're doing for food safety. If something happens to be contaminated, you can't necessarily use a wash or use post-harvest water to get it back to clean again, right? Or uncontaminated. That isn't what it's doing. What it's doing is making it where all the rest of your product that is uncontaminated isn't going to also become contaminated. There's nothing you can do with that one piece of contaminated product. Now, risk profiling would tell you that that one piece of contaminated product, if you're doing everything right, managing your water, cleaning and sanitizing, that's not what's going to lead you to a big outbreak or recall, okay? But if we're not doing the right things in terms of managing our water, then we're going to get this big volume of product that can potentially become contaminated. And that's where we have our issues. So that's why this managing piece of it is the critical piece. So let's go to the next slide. So like I said, what is it not used for? It's definitely not a kill step, right? Can't do that. It's definitely not going to unadulterate contaminated product. I think I kind of made that clear. It's definitely not going to be used in lieu of gaps, right? This is, again, just to take something and make it where you're not going to have a bigger problem. And that's because we know water is such a great way to move things around, right? And so we don't want to have that massive, widespread contamination. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, so maybe your first question is to wash or not wash, right? That is the question. Do we have to wash? We certainly feel, or it feels like most people feel like they need to, but let's go to the next slide. So no, they do not have to wash. Believe it or not, the FSMA produce safety rule does not require growers or packers to wash produce. Again, what does the FSMA produce safety rule require? They are going to require, of course, that you start out with that best quality water, right? No detectable generic E. coli. And then they're going to make sure that you are able to maintain that quality. So this is going to lead us to things like water change schedules, right? Visually monitoring that water quality. Other types of things that we'll talk about, maybe depending on your commodity, managing water temperature, or thinking about things like that. And again, we've got really nice visuals to talk about all these types of things. But again, go ahead and go to the next slide, Faith. But again, we do find ourselves in these situations where we might need to use water in our post-harvest settings. And so why would we do this? Well, it could be that it's a buyer or an industry requirement. It could be that we want to do this for aesthetics or quality. We just talked a lot about that we can use our post-harvest washing to enhance our quality of our product, potentially make it better looking, reduce spoilage microorganisms, increase that shelf life, all really, really beneficial things for the marketplace. So if we are going to wash, how can we minimize these food safety risks? Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is sort of one of our newer slides that we've kind of put together, and we're still really working on it. So we'd love some feedback on it, but really getting into this sort of risk profiling for these harvest and post-harvest systems. So of course, if we want to move the needle, if you find yourself maybe over in a high or a medium risk, if we want to move the needle back over to low risk, I think we can get back over there, but that's where we're going to talk about water management, right? How are we actually managing and what are we doing? And that's sort of where Faith is going to get into a lot of the nooks and crannies of this presentation. But if we think through and just look at some of these pictures on the slide, we could be doing things like field packing. Maybe that's a very low risk activity, very low use of water. You might be just using it potentially to clean off those pack tables. We could be using things like single pass water, right? Where you're just spraying something down on some type of graded table or something like that. Again, single pass water, very easy to manage, right? At that point, maybe you're just making sure you don't have biofilm buildup on the hose or the sprayer that you're using. We could be using single pass water, right? Like a spray bar. Again, water it's not necessarily being recirculated here. Good quality water is coming out, very easy to maintain. Again, at this point, we're really just thinking about how do we prevent maybe any kind of biofilm or some type of, biofilm on the nozzles, right? And that, again, comes back to proper sanitation or maybe use of a sanitizer if needed. We also might be using things like top icing. Again, our ice should be of that good quality water. And so then we're thinking about how are we managing or storing our ice, right? So we've seen it in all different capacities, whether this be in something like an ice maker, where again, what do you have to do to maintain that quality of that ice maker? Or do you see it on the floor where it's moving it in big bobcats or, types of situations like that, and thinking through traffic patterns and flow, right? Making sure that ice isn't going to potentially get contaminated. Then we go into situations that push us more over to this medium or high risk category. And this is where we really get into our batch or our recirculated water, things like coolers or putting things in tubs or flumes. Where we have this batch or this recirculated water, yes, we know when we start it, it's at good quality water because we've already tested and proved that it's at no detectable generic E. coli. But as we go out through our operational run of continuing to put product and continuing to run product through, that's where we really have to think through how are we going to maintain that quality. And this usually leads us to some type of management, probably using a sanitizer, which is going to push us back over into that more low risk profiling. If we didn't use the sanitizer here, this is really challenging. How are we going to keep it? How are we going to manage it? Well, produce safety rule is going to tell you that you're going to need to figure out when to change that water. So they're already kind of forcing your hand at it. But again, making sure you use that sanitizer is just giving you where you're pushing that needle all the way more closer to that low risk. And again, we'll talk about examples with that, but this is just sort of a visual. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Faith. Okay, so minimizing or managing risk, right? This is for you, those of you who like to read instead of pictures, but we could consider field packing. We could consider dry packing. Do we not have to necessarily use water? Could we consider cooling without dunking? Right. So again, this might be spraying it off. This might be other types of situations. Is there a way that we can maybe do forced air cooling? Can we do a single pass system? Again, always a recommendation to put a low dose sanitizer in there to prevent biofilm buildup. If we're going to use a recirculated or a batch system, and this is something that we need to have because, we've got to move a lot of product, or it's just the necessary evil that we're left with. We really want to consider using that sanitizer, right, to help us maintain that quality of water, but also to make it sure that if we did have a potential piece of contaminated product come in where microorganisms go off into that water, they're going to be killed by the sanitizer. So science is going to tell you must use a sanitizer. Not sure why that was left out, but I'm really going to tell you the science is going to tell you that you should really must do it. I'm just going to go with must use a sanitizer. Science is telling you it's really, really good in these batch and recirculated systems. We also want to consider a water change schedule, right, to reduce the organic debris. We'll talk more about that. And then thinking if we can come up with some sort of plans or SOPs to really prevent the buildup of organic matter, whether this be culling or sorting. Can we take something that maybe is grown in the ground and use some sort of, spray table and then put it into a recirculated or batch type situation, but we've removed a lot of that organic debris. What can we do, right? Can we use filtration systems? Like I said, pre-wash commodities, clean bins before they're submerged, or at least, hose them off, different things like that. So let's go to the next slide. So this sort of leads us to this really big thing. We've talked a little bit about, okay, washing is not mandatory. So certainly if we can go away from it, let's go away from it. But if we can't and we need to use it because a buyer's telling us, or we need to use it for an aesthetic or for a shelf life enhancement type activity, then we really want to think through, considering reducing that time that it's in contact with the water. But if we're stuck where we might need to use something, like I said, where we have these recirculated or batch systems, this really gets us into sanitizers. Sanitizers are, again, science is going to tell us that this is the best way to reduce that risk of potential cross-contamination. And if you can manage it and do it appropriately, it's really going to reduce your risk of having these potential bigger food safety issues. And this is going to lead us into our whole conversation about diving into this more in depth around the produce safety rule in particular. So I think this leads it over to you, Faith, and your awesome animation.
So thanks, Laura, for teeing me up there. I would say, honestly, like what I like to emphasize with growers is that we're not putting that sanitizer in there in the water to prevent that contaminated piece of produce and to make it fine for consumption. So I find that, we can say those words all the time and always talk about cross-contamination, but sometimes people just need to see something, right? So I always like to start with, okay, and I know these aren't really very good, realistic tomatoes, but there we go. There's our clip art. So in reality, we're not going to know if we have contamination with a foodborne pathogen. They will look perfectly fine. They're going to look fine to harvest. You're not going to know that invisible threat that's coming into your packing house. And we should expect, hopefully because we're following good agricultural practices, that those rates of contamination are held really low. But it should not astound us if these pathogens are in the environment and that's where we're growing the produce, that we're going to have a few that slip through. So while we can see them here with our yellow dots, we're not going to know that when they come in. And in this case, say we needed to wash, right? We have our tomatoes, they're getting ready to go. And then we have our washing, the step. If we didn't have a sanitizer in there, what happens is that this washing step, where many times we are immersing, and as Laura already mentioned, and we'll emphasize again, the data tells us the more you submerge that produce, the longer the contact time is, the more transfer you're going to get occurring, if it is likely to occur at all. So in this condition, we're going to have a few of these microorganisms that fall off. And what that does is it turns our, batch washing step into essentially an inoculation vat for everything else that comes in afterwards. And it's all going to go unnoticed by you. And essentially, like if they need a real life example, the Jensen Farms outbreak is probably one of our best examples. And when we went back and looked at what maybe went wrong there, that is probably where one of the biggest areas where they went wrong is not properly managing that post-harvest washing step. And we're talking a lot about batch washing here, but this can also, there's also benefits to using sanitizers and single pass and spray bar systems too. So it's not unlikely, but yeah, that next tomato is then going to come out with a lower level inoculum, but it's going to most likely pick up some of these pathogens that are transferred. So I find that a lot of times when you're like, okay, let's flip the script, and then let's have our same scenario go through, but instead this time we actually have a sanitizer in this water. And what's going to happen is our tomatoes are still going to travel through, and then we're going to have our microorganisms fall off, but instead of staying in the water, we're actually going to eliminate them. And so when our next tomato travels through, we're not going to have that cross-contamination occur. And because we are maintaining the hygienic quality of that water. That is our take home for any grower for what they want to, what we want to see them do when they go through this system. I find some people also like numbers. So this is just some data. We were actually looking at alternative sanitizers. And this is essentially what we ran as 2 different controls in a study that we did that Laurel Dunn helped publish in addition to some of my work at the University of Tennessee. What this number shows us is that we started with really, as with any challenge study, we inoculate the fruit at really high concentration. So we're starting already at like 10 million cells, right? And what we found is that after we put one contaminated tomato through it, 10 million cells, which is a lot. You would not expect to have that many present. What we saw, I think, though, these 2 different scenarios speak volumes, right? Because what we saw in this study is that, with our water only, where we didn't have a single sanitizer going into that batch submersion system, we got pretty good transfer. And you're like 218,000, that's a lot. But it's less than 1%, right? Actually making it through, it's pretty low when you look at it on a percent transfer basis. And so the lower the numbers going in, the less likely we are to see that transfer occurring, but still you see that carried over. And essentially we're making this an inoculation vat for anything else that would come in afterwards. And again, you're not going to even know that that's occurring in production. The flip side of this is that if we dosed at 150 parts per million free chlorine, again, we are trying to have a really stringent, negative control essentially for what would, really tight control over the water quality. 150, a lot of people look at that and they're like, that's way too high. Although we definitely have labels that are approved for that. A lot more people are somewhere in that 20 to 50 part per million free chlorine. But even then, you can see how much the situation is neutralized. And I would say even at those lower concentrations, depending upon organic matter, you still get really rapid inactivation. It happens very quickly so that you do not have that transfer onto the following tomatoes that would go through or in the water itself. So eliminating it at that point. When we think about with growers, it's really important to know kind of who's in the room and how they're washing things. So to me, I always like, if I don't know them, then I would actually bring bring that up as kind of getting to know you first start. And normally we see kind of a couple of different flavors where we have batch washing systems. These are typically small volumes, a tub with water sort of scenario. These are going to be the things where it's much smaller volumes, so you can change over those water much more rapidly, but they have to be changing it over. And we'll talk a little bit about turbidity and where it may fall within the ability for you to change over water, or if you just visually assess the water and you change it out on some interim basis based upon like the dirtiest product that you would potentially pack out going through that batch system. Recirculate is kind of our next step up, and we see recirculate, a lot of times we would refer to these as flumes or dump tanks. These are much larger volumes. So we're talking about thousands of gallons of water in these systems, much larger entities. But even in that recirculation system, we're going to have that water resonating within that flume or that dump tank for a really long period of time. Some industries dump on a shift basis because it is such a large volume of water. Others will carry them over for multiple days. And it's really important that they have a proper sanitizer in there that's going to work at the highest organic loads that you're going to experience. And that is something that we can talk through, kind of how to walk them through and get there. But typically these are a bit more mature and larger entities. And if they are larger, but not mature, well, then it's around conversation around like, do we really need to be doing this? Is this the best thing? Single pass, we usually, as Laura already mentioned, we think about this as much lower risk, but I will tell you that anytime you put water in the mix, you increase cross-contamination between a contaminated piece of produce and whatever else is coming in contact with. So that's why you see in many industries, even though it's not recirculated water, it's only going one time through the system, they're still using a sanitizer in that water. For smaller growers, they can hook up a dosatron basically in line that will pull out the sanitizer through their hose, right? And that's one way that they can get around that. If they're kind of wondering like, well, how does this fit in if I'm just using municipal water or well water coming out of my systems? That would be how we would augment that, because we could still see some cross-contamination. As Laura mentioned, essentially it's more about sanitizing that surface. A lot of times we're on brush beds or grates or things that aren't necessarily as easily cleaned. So it does help us maintain that hygienic surface so it's not cross-contaminating. So what's the best sanitizer out there? Everybody just wants to tell you what should they use, right? And you can't do that as the educator. You really have to think about and walk them through the sort of things that they want to consider when they're picking out a sanitizer. So how the sanitizer is going to be used, which of those scenarios are they using it for? What is the crop being packed, right? How is the water being applied? And definitely the more submersion we have, the longer the contact time, the greater the risk of cross-contamination if you're not properly managing that water quality. Recirculation is going to build up organic load. We're going to show a little bit of information here about how organic load and why it's important as far as some of our sanitizers, why that's an important factor. How long is the water going to be used before it's replaced? One of the first things I would talk to people that are reusing water over multiple days is that letting them know, okay, that essentially extends the period. If something goes wrong, worst case scenario, and somebody comes in and does an investigation for cause, they're going to look at that entire period of time that water's been used as the longest period between a clean break. And then also think about the factors we discuss on some commonly used sanitizers that we'll touch on here briefly. So of course, you've all seen these slides, right? In the PSA, and we could expound upon this for a really long period of time. Advanced PSA is a really great place to learn more and to dig deeper. And I think that we're always learning. And if you feel like you're a novice, keep on digging in, because you as the educator have to be the most well-versed in how these factors impact water quality. So with water pH, we're going to talk about free chlorine, because I find that free chlorine tends to be the hardest thing for people to manage as far as all the different factors at play. So we'll go through the kind of tried and true terminology around free chlorine and the things that impact free chlorine's effectiveness. And I would say if it doesn't resonate with you, keep on going back and listening again and again, because you really need to be able to describe this to growers so that you can better help them troubleshoot when they come to you with questions. We're going to talk a little bit about water turbidity. Essentially, what water turbidity is getting at is how much organic load is coming into that water. And I don't care what the sanitizer is, they are all impacted as far as efficacy goes. With the more organic matter that's in it, in the water, the less effectiveness you're going to see as far as their ability to inactivate a microorganism that falls into that water. And I don't care if it's PAA or chlorine. A lot of times we harp on chlorine a lot because it's probably one of the ones that's most impacted by water, but I have data and plenty of other people have done research here that regardless of the sanitizer, they're all the ones that we commonly use are oxidizers, and they're all going to be interfered with from organic load in that water. Water temperature, we'll touch on it briefly, talk about infiltration. A lot of times you feel like you're talking out both sides of your mouth when you talk about water temperature, because inevitably, even when we're hydrocooling, we're exposing that product to water to hopefully transfer some of that heat out of that product. cool it down more rapidly. But even in those like lower, I would say like not submersion scenarios, we're still getting uptake of water, right? It's very rare that you would ever expose a product to water. And then if you wait it before and after, you're going to see an uptick in weight. And that uptick is because it's taking in water. The sanitizer concentration, we'll walk through an exercise here in a moment, looking at sanitizers and labels. I would say the PSA's tool that we're all familiar with, looking at those labels, is a really great one. It's really nice for you to be informed about what your growers are using as far as sanitizer concentration goes, and also what sanitizer types they're using, so you can be most familiar with those labels. Contact time, again, we're not sanitizing the produce, we're sanitizing the water, but in every label, we still have a contact time, and the label is the law. So being mindful of that as far as when you're applying those. And what sort of system is it set up for? Is it more that flume or batch washing system, or through a spray bar? And many labels will actually differentiate different conditions under different exposure scenarios. So just a little bit about turbidity, because we mentioned that that is really important. I'm going to get to pH and when I start talking about chlorine. You know, if we were taking produce, even produce is grown off the ground, we're going to see in many instances some soil load buildup because of wind transfer. We are also going to, you know, have maybe some decay or something along those lines coming in there occasionally. Leaf matter, all sorts of things will contribute to turbidity of our water. Soils, though, the biggest driver. Turbidity essentially allows us to look at, you know, a crude estimate of how much organic load is going into the water. And I would say that the higher the turbidity, the lower the quality of your water, and also the less effectiveness you're going to see out of your sanitizer. So if you hold the concentration of the sanitizer the same and you move from low turbidity to high turbidity water, we'd expect to see less inactivation of our target microorganisms in the high turbidity water. I would say that chemical oxygen demand, or COD, is a factor that is much more accurate in measuring organic load of a water. The problem is it's not a real-time measurement. It takes you, if you have everything on site, it takes you 4 hours to measure it. It's something that people are not going to be able to do in real time and respond to, whereas you can with turbidity. And we do get a kind of a what I would call a moderate correlation between turbidity. We can see here in this graph, right? So as we go up in turbidity, we can notice, and these are real-time measurements from a flume, from data that we collected in Washington State, where they use this water, again, it's tree fruit, but they're using this water many times for 2 to 3 days in their flumes, given the water volume, but they're treating it the entire time and dosing and monitoring that the entire time. I said that COD was a little bit better reference for us, but there's about an R squared of 8.8. So that means 80% of the change in turbidity also is reflected in the change of COD, which is pretty good as far as correlations go. But you can also tell that, you know, sometimes we throw out arbitrary values for turbidity. And, you know, we can see here that we actually never got to a reading higher than 300 as far as turbidity goes. 250 was the highest turbidity reading we saw. And we saw relatively high chemical oxygen demand levels all the way up to 2,500 parts per million, which is quite high. Now, is it as high as what you would get maybe if you're washing potatoes? No, you're getting up to like 10,000 or higher there. But in essence, we do know that a chlorine or PA sanitizer behaves much more slowly, and you typically need higher concentrations at 2,500 COD versus 500 COD. So for those entities, those smaller growers, let them know that turbidity can be a measurement that they use, and let them understand why they're using turbidity, right? For the entities that are a bit larger and have a bit more at risk, I would say maybe start socializing the idea. Maybe you should start doing some of these studies where you're determining how much turbidity links up to COD. Where we have probably the least amount of correlation is the more they have actual filtration units going in, and these are not crude filtration. The reverse osmosis, the whole 9 yards can be going into these systems so that they can get the longest life out of their water. We can also go down all sorts of rabbit holes that, like minerals coming in aren't necessarily as great a factor when it comes to all organic loads, the same basically, but humic acids, our proteins, our carbohydrates play a little bit larger role, with proteins probably being the hardest thing, but we're lucky in most cases that we don't have a lot of protein being contributed. So as that quality drops, our demand increases, and the amount of sanitizer that we'll need overall, as we have that increase in turbidity and that increase in organic load, we will need to optimally dose with higher sanitizers. And what I would say for most people, keep it simple, stupid, is try and set the sanitizer level that you're trying to hit based on the worst case water quality that you may experience, versus trying to dynamically change it in real time. Infiltration is something we always talk about. And, when you talk about hydrocooling and actually putting hot produce into cold water versus where, again, it's cascading water, right? Versus really looking at, a hot tomato going into a flume, we know that there's a few things at play. First is water temperature definitely impacts efficacy of a sanitizer. The cooler that water is, the less activity we see in a sanitizer in a given period of time. Whereas if the water is warmer, I actually get more rapid and active. And it's just the kinetics of the chemistries themselves. So know that the cooler the water is, the higher you may have to dose it a sanitizer. And you would want to look for studies that, all of us that work in this area are trying to get more and more information on, so that you can draw, appropriate conclusions about how much temperature may be impacting a certain sanitizer. I don't think you're ever going to see this necessarily on a label, though. Also, we always talk about infiltration. So we know that temperature differential is, we have a really nice picture here with that. We had basically this tomato soaking in dye-colored water. And so we can see that infiltration came in this tomato around the stem scar. Sometimes you'll also see it come in around maybe the bloom end also, but we have these natural openings within the produce, and it will uptake that water if that temperature differential is enough. I would say that there are certain commodities we pick out for this. Tomatoes definitely come to mind as one of those that they actually boost the temperature of their water. What I would say for most growers is just to emphasize, it's really important, since we know we're going to have a little bit of uptake, no matter what, make sure that water is as high a quality as possible. So everything you're doing to prevent cross-contamination would also benefit you here. There's a study highlighted by Zhu et al., who also looked at time, immersion depth, and temperature on infiltration. And essentially what they found is that minimizing the contact time between fruit and water, minimizing that depth of submersion, and having things really in a monolayer versus packing in the flumes too tight so that you had like produce, fruit on top of fruit, all reduced infiltration. So these are all things that you can, talk to those risk managers about as far as things that they could do to try and prevent that. When it came to chemical sanitizer regulations, again, a lot of times these labels, I get it, they're complicated to look at, and they're all different. You can take, 10 different chlorine products that are all labeled for post-harvest washing of fruits and vegetables, and they'll all have a different label. Even from a specific supplier, you'll have 2 different products that have 2 totally different labels because they're different audiences that they're marketing to. So know that for these sanitizers, the label is the law. You're going to be looking for washing of fruits and vegetables specific for if you're washing fruits and vegetables, right? Look for the appropriate concentration and minimum contact time. I have an exercise next that we'll walk through. That label, although it maybe is complex, as an educator, I would dig in and try and get those questions answered, especially for those products that are most routinely used by your clients. So we're going to do a little bit of a label hunt. So Donna, if you can upload into the chat the Sanidate label, and everybody can go ahead and click on that link. I like doing this with my extension clients when I lived in the extension world, because I think it does help emphasize, like at least walking through one label and these things that you've told them to look for. So the first question is, what is the EPA registration number? Oh, sorry. Here, I'm gonna grab this really quick.
Sorry about that, Faith. I think I have candidate 5.
It's all good. We changed it on you last minute, Donna, so it's all good.
Thanks, Faith.
Yeah. So I just put in there the Sanidate 15.0 label. We're going to be using Sanidate 15.0. So what's the EPA registration number? In this case, it's 70299-26. And you'll notice, because some of you were looking at the Sanidate 5.0 label, everything's pretty much the same except for those last 2 numbers, which are actually specific to Sanidate 15.0. So that's a little bit of the inside for how labels are created. So all of BioSafe's products have that same initial number. Okay. You can also see on this, we have our active ingredients. That's also really important to know. So if people didn't know, this is a proxyacetic acid based product. I would say it's also important to understand why they may be confused, because there's more than one active ingredient here, right? Hydrogen peroxide is also an antimicrobial, although typically we're telling them to monitor for proxyacetic acid in these products. So what page can you find the instructions for treatment of water on? And you can just type it into the chat. Yeah, page 2. Thank you, guys. Yeah, so a lot of times it's nice for them to look through the whole label. And if you're doing this in person, you just print out the labels and you have them look on them. One of the biggest areas that they confuse when they're doing this is they'll look up the sanitation of food contact surfaces. That's most commonly the label, the area of the label, if they get it wrong, that they'll go to. But yep, y'all are smart cookies. I'm teaching an educator, so y'all are already ahead of the curve. So I've zoomed in to that portion of the label. What ppm of PA is your target in this label? Yeah, and Betsy's right. Not all products are going to be labeled for produce. Yeah, even if I use somebody else's PA product, it may not be labeled for post-harvest washing. Yeah, so 40 to 100 parts per million is my target of proxyacetic acid. It can be confusing because right after it is the hydrogen peroxide, right? So tell them that, we're going to be monitoring for proxyacetic acid. That will also help drive the appropriate concentration of hydrogen peroxide. What's the dosing per 25 gallons is our next question. Y'all didn't know we're going to be making you work.
At least you're not making them do math, Faith.
I know. I did take that one out, right? Yep. 1.8 or 0.8 to 1.9 fluid ounces. That's a really low concentration. That's why most small growers are not going to use Sanidate 15.0 because it's such a small volume, right? When they're adding in there. But what's the contact time? 90 seconds. And that is a function that, this specific product has organisms of public health importance on its label. Most products do not, but all of them will have a concentration and contact time. Those are all integral things when we're thinking about dosing of chemistries. And so being mindful of that. With cyanidate 15.0, I'm going to talk about chlorine here briefly, but we don't need to control for pH because you're essentially adding a bunch of acids that will help moderate pH. So it's not as important a factor. It's not going to be called out and controlled for in this scenario. And then another thing we may want to look for is like, do I really need to rinse? Because sometimes if you treat at a higher concentration, you'll have to do a potable water rinse afterwards. We even see that with organic production, where if you're using a chlorine-based compound, they'll want you to come back and do that potable water rinse with nothing more than 4 parts per million free chlorine for those organic producers. Great. So where do we commonly see used in post-harvest washing? Because I think a lot of people do get tripped up in the chemistries. It is going to be hypochlorites. So that's our chlorine-based compounds that either come in liquid or powder form. Sodium hypochlorites are typical like product we're familiar with from doing laundry or bleaching things. Calcium is much more concentrated, and it's going to be in a powder tablet form. Peroxyacetic acid or peracetic acid is our other product that we just walked through, and it typically comes in concentrations ranging from 5 to 15%. I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly, on chlorine chemistry. So, because I find that chlorine has the biggest hangups with it. It's also the cheapest. So there's a reason that people stick with it, but free chlorine is always going to be the form of chlorine that gives us our antimicrobial power. So that's what we always want to monitor for. Sometimes you'll also see this referred to as available chlorine. So know that that terminology is synonymous with free chlorine. But just beyond free chlorine, we have to get in the correct form. So that is why pH is so important for chlorine. Because what we're doing when we take chlorine, either in a liquid form, which is shown here, or a calcium tablet form shown here, or even chlorine gas, what we do is basically we form an acid, and that acid is called hypochlorous acid. And that is actually the antimicrobial that we want that will inactivate microorganisms. So that hypochlorous acid is what we're trying to get the most percentage of when we take these compounds and dissolve them into water. So to help you keep it straight, hypochlorous acid, good, right? But what happens is that we can also have something that is going to be read as free chlorine. If we checked a test strip or a titration kit, we would see this compound, the hypochlorite ion, also read in the free chlorine, right, category. You're not going to be able to differentiate these two. What hypochlorite ion is that this is basically the acid breaking apart and deprotonating. And why that is important is that something that is charged isn't going to be able to inactivate the microorganism the way that we need it to. So when does hypochlorite ion predominate? It is when we get to pH of 7 or above. So 7, 8, 9, these would all be situations where we're not going to be forming very much hypochlorous acid. You would take a test strip and you would find that your free chlorine readings are where you want them to be, but your compound is not in the proper form. So that's why we always say that if you're using chlorine, it's also important to know what the pH of that water is and to monitor for that in duality. So hypochlorous acid, we take our sodium hypochlorite, it kicks off sodium, hydrogen ion comes in here, and we form hypochlorous acid. That is what we want. If the pH of that water is neutral or slightly basic, we will form way more of the hypochlorite ion. It will not be in the acid form or deprotonated form. And I would say the other part that you aren't thinking about is that by adding the compound alone, you are already producing a base, because what happens is that sodium combines with your leftover water and produces sodium hydroxide, which is a base. And so the glug-glug method of dosing post-harvest water, only shoot yourself in the foot because you're only wasting chemistry, because you're driving that pH more basic, forming more of the hypochlorite ion and very little actually in the deprotonated acid form, the hypochlorous acid. Sodium hydroxide is not going to be great. It's going to drive and make our pH more basic. And many times people ask, well, how do I control for this? That's why in larger facilities, they actually add acids, and you can find organic acids like citric acid or inorganic acids like phosphoric acid that will be added to water to try and keep that pH of that water buffered so that it is more along the 6 to 7 range. So because sodium hydroxide is a base, the more you add, the more basic your pH is going to shift. And many times, especially increased concentrations, that's why we also have to simultaneously dose with an acidifying agent like citric acid. This is what people who are organic tend to lean towards, or phosphoric acid if you're packing conventional. So chlorine, pH, and organic matter are definitely important. Water hardness, the time and temperature you're exposing to, concentration of the sanitizer you're using, greater the concentration, typically the more inactivation, and also how much are you trying to control for biofilms are all things that we can think about. Advantages to hypochlorites, they tend to be broad spectrum, they're hard water tolerant, they're low temperature, have activity at low temperature, although it's slowed. The biggest thing is that they're relatively inexpensive compared to many of our chemistries. They don't form a film like some of our other compounds that we may be used to on the surface sanitizing side. Disadvantages, the lower, people are like, well, why don't I just shift the pH all the way down to like 2? That's not great either, because at that time, the hypochlorous acid actually devolves into a chlorine gas, and you actually start gassing people with chlorine, which is not what we want. And it's not in water. And so we do not want that. We can also see that really high temperatures, but typically that's 140 or greater. So really more so that low pH is also not where we want to live. Typically we tell people somewhere in that range, right around 6.5 is a nice place to try and aim for. It is corrosive to equipment. It is an irritant to people. It is unstable. And it has environmental concerns, such as mainly the disinfection byproducts that are formed, like haloacetic acids that are known carcinogens. But again, many times the concentrations we're using, and through not allowing too much organic buildup in the water, we're managing that. Again, when it comes to growers, we want to tell them like, okay, we have to monitor, right? So we're going to be using test strips, and we're going to be targeting free chlorine specific to chlorine. We're also going to want to monitor for pH. So actually having them hands-on go through this and try and make sure they can actually implement this. And I know that I'm running short on time, but I would say just keep on trying to dig into that chemistry and bring it home. But some of our take-home things, that washing produce isn't mandatory. So if people are going to do it poorly, let's not have them do it at all. Where we can avoid it, let's do that. And consider reducing the time produce is in contact with water. So try our spray tables scenarios, especially that can be far more effective for some of our smaller entities. Again, science supports using sanitizers in all systems. So even in our single pass systems, there's a benefit there, but definitely in our batch and recirculated systems, that water is not going to be of adequate sanitary quality once you start using it. Laura, I think you're going to talk us through a couple of the.
Yeah, we'll just go super, super quick. And I think everybody here obviously is a fan or a lover of the PSA, but these post-harvest water decision trees from the Cornell GAPS program, I stumbled upon them when I was researching for this talk, and I actually think they're really fantastic. I have no idea if you have plans to update them or not, but they're a great place to start, right? They tell you start with clean water and then kind of give you this decision thought process to think about as you go through how you would manage your harvest and post-harvest quality water. So I would check them out for sure, because I thought they were fantastic. Next slide. And then if you're still sort of one of these people who likes the cheat codes, which I do, I think the Produce Safety Alliance sanitizer tool is fantastic, right? They've got great tutorials on it, but it's awesome. You can sort it, and they give you the cheat codes to how to look at the sanitizer labels, right? And what's on it and what it's used for. And, again, giving you all that information, cheat codes. Next. And then if you're a person who likes the cliff notes, I'll just tell you how to just completely save time. If you're a person that likes the Cliff Notes version, Keith Schneider came up with these really cool block videos. He talks about basic chemistry, pH effects, and then why, in the example, why chlorine isn't better, like Faith just mentioned, right? It's also not better because it, saves you money. But again, because you're making it more basic, this is a great example. Again, if you're a visual person, the videos are all maybe 90 seconds. And they all do these really cool blocks. They're fantastic. I actually used them in a class with middle schoolers last week, and it was great. So I think that's it, right? Okay, more information, right? There's lots of really good stuff. Search Faith Critzer's name. She's got good things out there for you. But yeah, we're always here to help. I think most of you know how to get a hold of us. If not, you could talk to anybody on PSA and they could tell you, or you could Google us. My email pops up, and Faith's and Michelle's.
In true
So.
academic style, we went long. Sorry.
That's okay. I can pop back and share a wrap up screen, or we can just wrap up here. So I do want to just start out by really saying, that's what I want to start out by saying. Wrong one here. Hang on. Sorry, that went horribly. Okay, so maybe I'll just wrap up there. Thank you guys for a great presentation. It was really fantastic in the sense of covering so many different things that need to be managed. I don't know about you guys, but I sort of hope the takeaway from this is if growers are going to do post-harvest water, there's a lot that goes into it. I think if that's a big theme we could drive home for everybody, I think that's really important. So in wrapping up, I just really do want to thank Faith, Michelle, Laura, Keith, who's not here, but those little videos are, fantastic. People love them. The growers really love them. If you haven't used them with growers and you use them with growers, they're going to ask you for them so they can share them with their friends. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. I know we are a few minutes over, but keep the comments and the suggestions coming so we can keep the focus on these webinars on things you value. As we did at the last one, are you feeling like you still want post-harvest water stuff? Do we want to keep going? You can put your answer in the chat box. Is something along these lines good, or have you had enough post-harvest water? I know our Spanish language extension associates are going through that as well. So let us know in the chat box if you think, yeah, keep the post-harvest going. Otherwise, we can jump to a different subject. As always, I really like to give a shout out to the PSA team, just because if you have questions and we can help you out, please reach out and we'll try and answer as best we can, connect you to the people that you need to be connected to. Here's our PSA website in English and in Spanish. So you have all that information and you can follow us on social media. So with that, a last shout out to Laura, Faith, and Michelle, who are on the call, Keith, who is not with us. Thanks to Donna. Thanks to Don for corralling this one and making sure the organization happened. Any last parting words?
I think just telling people, like, if it all seems too much to wash, well, then let's not wash. I think that's a perfect take home for most people. And they kind of like, a lot of times they're selling direct to consumers. They kind of like the dirt, right? At the farmer's market, it's not so big of a turnoff. So open up that door a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or just try to minimize, right, those batch or recirculated systems, because it's not too hard, right? It's like Faith mentioned, to kind of hook up something to do a really low dose sanitizer injection into like a spray bar or something like that. But when you have it where you have to manage all these different things, temperature and, whether or not the organic load and the sanitizer, that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. So, but some really good questions in here. I think Annalise mentioned like some practical like demos on like how you would know when to change your water out. And so we'll think about those. So I think Trevor Seslow had a really good one that I went to at one of his workshops that I'll look and see if I can find the slide set for.
Yeah, we just done one, I think, getting to the turbidity issue, which I know we've all talked about. We just did one, and the differences in the types of turbidity is really the thing. You can get something that's incredibly turbid and not messing with your chlorine. And then you can get something that's mildly turbid and you got no chlorine left.
So maybe the big take home, Betsy, is that it's really important to look at your system, right? And really understand what you're doing, and that there isn't this universal take home, take home for everybody. It's really just you looking at your own system, figuring out, what's your water quality look like? What does it look like when you put in your product? What sanitizer you're using, et cetera, and then being able to have those conversations with the inspectors, right?
Yeah, and I think really what is causing the changes in your system? Is it because fruit's breaking? Is it sand from the soil? What exactly is causing that turbidity, and what's the impact it's having? I also think the other thing that was a big take home when Faith went through the label, I think growers are always surprised how little sanitizer has to be added to 25 gallons. It's not like, we always joke about the glug glug. By the time you get to a glug glug, you're past that dose. You're way past that dose, right? And I think that's the other thing folks don't recognize if they've never actually done it, is just how little amount of sanitizer can be effective in these small batch water systems, right? A bottle of sanitizer goes a long way.
If you can smell it, you should wonder if you shouldn't really, in most of these concentrations, that it's really not discernible, right?
No. And that's exactly, when you said if you could smell it, I'm like, you've probably put in too much. And that's, I think, what people don't understand. They really do feel like it's a lot of chemical, and it's not actually a lot of chemical to get to that effective range. All right, well, now we've politely gone over by several minutes. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, PSA team, Donna, for all the hosting. And until next time, let us know what you want to talk about next. Thank you all.